In this video I'm going to give you my version of Grimdark and how I think it's different from what usually comes up if you type in Grimdark in the YouTube search. And I'll show you how I achieved all of these effects without the use of oil paints and enamels.
What's up, fellow pigment pushers? Grimdark can mean a lot of things. It all depends on the context and of course artistic interpretation. But let me give you my view on Grimdark and my interpretation in the context of miniature painting. Grimdark painting has often been referred to as not needing a lot of skill, which is something I disagree on. But I think it comes from the idea that if you just threw on enough of dirt, grime and rust products on a miniature, it automatically becomes Grimdark. And if a style has the literal definition of the 40k universe in the name, it kind of becomes validated and it's worth more than its individual parts, instead of just a dirty miniature. To me, Grimdark is not about dirt and definitely not about using certain products like oil paints and enamel washes. It's more like when I think about Warhammer 40k, everything being old and archaic and banged up and makeshift, because there's constant war and there's attrition of gear and also of people.
One observation I made is that Grimdark very often becomes synonym with blanchitsu, which draws from colors of a certain palette. And those colors incidentally line up with colors of dirt and rust. Beige white because it stains up nicely, red and red-brown and sepia tones. But using that palette alone, in my opinion, does not automatically make something Grimdark. John Blanchy himself said that he's inspired a lot by colors that Rembrandt was using in a lot of his work, and you can clearly see that. However, I don't see any Grimdark in these pictures. If we look at these miniatures that he painted, I do not really think of Grimdark. I think more about the style of painting and using a limited palette, like for example the Soren palette. Grimdark to me is not defined by color. To me, Grimdark is about the stories, body horror that the inhabitants of the 40k universe have become desensitized to, because it's just a means to get ahead in a war that threatens the existence of all of humanity, and has become normal.
So how do you visualize this and transfer it onto miniatures, especially Space Marines? Just like 20th century tanks, formidable war machines would dirt up and gather dust and degrade under the stress of battle, I figure so would even the prime war machines of the Imperium. So in that way, Grimdark becomes a form of realism. The same way that tanks in war don't look fresh out of the factory, but not just a little banged up, but massively stressed and visibly under strain because of the constant impacts and traces of battle. Of course, the final product is just going to borrow a tiny bit from realism, a tiny bit from what is considered Grimdark, and I'm going to try to make something new, and I'm going to try to create my interpretation of the theme. In that way, it's neither realism nor Grimdark. So I tried to find a way to represent all of that, and I'm going to walk you through all of the experiments and trial of error process that it took me to realize the vision I had.
I went into this with a rough idea, which was having all armor panels look better than stressed and fading towards the edges. And I knew I had to have some element of irregularity in the final color, something you would traditionally maybe do with the Sol technique in scale modeling. But as you know by now, I like to paint my minis in the truest sense, and by that I mean using my brush as much as possible. However, sponges are neat for doing exactly what I was looking for. As you can see, they leave a more or less unpredictable pattern of coverage and non-coverage, I guess. When applying the first layer with Rhinoxide over black, the goal was to find a nice base to work off of, which means an irregular layer of brown and some black occasionally still shining through. Contrary to belief, I rarely have everything figured out when I start a new project, and additionally I love to experiment with things I never tried. So this was a possibility to find out how to create this weathered look and texture I was aiming for, and I decided to try two different approaches. On the first leg I used an older brush that did not just hold one tip anymore, but more like 5 of them. And this allows me to apply the color really fast, but I also have more control over where the bulk of the paint goes and which areas I cover. The individual dots are also relatively small, and looking at it, I think I really like that result. But let's have a go on the second leg with just a sponge. This is definitely a little faster, and I think I like the patterns too, but it doesn't quite set up a consistent layer in the areas I later want to cover with brighter color. So comparing the two, I think sponging is definitely faster, while stippling with a brush will give you the most control. For my purposes, doing the initial patterns with a sponge and putting in a little extra coverage with the brush seemed to be the way to go. And because I get this question a lot in the comments, I'll give you my thoughts on how to speed this up even more towards the end of the video. Right now I'm still learning the quirks of this myself, so we might as well be patient. I continued with a pure layer of Mephiston red, and I covered the bigger areas with the sponge, and wherever I couldn't properly reach or use the effect of the sponge properly, I switched to stippling by brush. At this point I also tried to find a way to restore some of the darker edges if I covered too much area, and I found out that it's pretty effective and simple to just stipple on a mix of Rhinoxide and black over these areas to make them darker again. One word about using a sponge for painting. Just like with a brush, you have to prepare the paint and the amount of paint you put on your tool. You also don't use the same nozzle size and amount of thinner and PSI for everything while you airbrush. You vary these things and you adapt to the situation. So here you want to get rid of some paint but not everything. Looking at this example here, the initial amount will probably be too much, and at the end the sponge leaves too little paint behind. So we have to find an acceptable balance that works exactly for the situation. And while the smaller specs are great for chipping, or in our case doing a bit of cleanup, we need more coverage to build the bulk of our layers. I think this is a great example for how miniature painting techniques can almost never be copy-paste solutions, and why thinking in techniques is often counterproductive. How would you call what I do with the sponge? Is it the sponge technique? Do we not think of sponge chipping when we talk about the sponge technique? But this does not look like sponge chipping at all, because we use way more paint. If you stop thinking of mini painting as these distinct incremental phases, like first we do step A in a clearly defined way, and then step B, then step C, but instead see everything we have at our disposal as a toolkit that you can adapt to what the situation needs, then you really start to grow as a painter, and you will get faster and your results will look better. When people ask me what to do to progress further from beginner and intermediate levels, this is exactly what I tell them. Next I keep building up the Mephiston red, which sometimes takes a couple of layers. And whenever I need to make the layer cover more area, or when I need more control, I switch to the brush. Like here in the collar, it would be almost impossible to use the sponge efficiently. The same goes for the forehead and these small areas on the chest plate. And here, I already switched to Evil Sun's Scarlet, which is almost my final highlight color. Because in some areas that I want brighter, usually because they would catch more light, I'm mixing in a bit of wolf grey. I use this mix to stipple on highlights on higher up areas, like for example the round knee part or apex points of curved structures. And where else I want more contrast. But before we continue, a few quick words about this video's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning platform with thousands of different classes on tons of interesting topics. Especially if you are a creative mind, you will love what Skillshare has to offer. For me, it was really easy to pick up the basics of watercolor painting, and it was fun to see so many different teachers on the platform with different styles and following along. The Skillshare library is massive. Just look at the videos on the topic of photography alone. And I know that there's a video for just about everything on YouTube, but these classes are taught by industry professionals, and the classes are built coherently and comprehensively, covering bigger topics in bite-sized chunks. If your time is limited, you can watch one part today and the other part another time, and you will easily be able to pick up where you left. Skillshare has helped me take better pictures with my smartphone, helped me with the software I use regularly, and there's even a couple of illustration classes taught by Jazza that I enjoyed a lot. Here you can see me applying everything I learned in my first watercolor class. But Skillshare does not only offer creative classes like painting, writing, animation and design, but they also cover business related topics like marketing, career advice and how to build an online presence. Skillshare is absolutely worth it, and I'm happy that I can offer full access to the website to the first 1,000 people that use the link in the description. And yes, that means you can watch absolutely everything on the platform, and you're also supporting this channel in the process. Why not give it a try? At this point I realized that I lost the blackened edge look in some areas, so I took a relatively undiluted black and worked over these edges. I think you can see that it massively improves the look. On some parts I use the brush with rather dried up paint, and it almost becomes dry brushing, only with the side of the brush and not completely dry paint, which gives some extra detail and a smudging effect. You can see that more clearly and explained in more detail in my Grimdark Necron video. Next I wanted to work on the black parts and quickly clean up all the areas I covered with red. while building up the gradients on the armor. On the eagle, I built some minimalistic gradients and highlights, mostly on the edges. The goal was just to have a bit of definition because I knew I would cover most of this with a wash later. For the bolter, I was not entirely sure what I wanted to do, so again I started to experiment. Initial code followed the principle of the red armor, and I sponged on in QB darkness and mixed in more and more wolf grey to build a structure, and then used almost pure wolf grey for the edge highlights. Then I dulled down everything with 2 thin layers of Agric Earth Shade, which really dulls down everything, so I went over the edge highlights again. And in a very similar way, I built a few rough highlights on the armor trims. While I was working on this, it bothered me a bit how clean the bolter looked in comparison to the rest. I think if you wanted the bolter to not stand out at all, this would be fine, but I just wanted to draw more attention to it, so I used Nurgling green to paint on a few chips and dents. I'm relatively fast at this because I have practiced doing this with a brush a lot, but you could just do sponge chipping here instead if you're not that confident in your brush skills yet. Compared to this intense outline of the bolter, the rest of the armor now lacked a bit of definition. And at this point I wanted to experiment with really subtle graphite highlights on the edges, like it's done sometimes in scale modeling. Like I said, the goal was to create something of a blend of realistic and grimdark, so this looked like something worth exploring. I don't think it looks really cool, but long story short, it's impractical. This would most certainly rub off either when you touch the miniature or in the later stages of the paint job whenever I would use a wash on top, or just any wet brush that would touch this would just undo it again. Going back to the bolter, I quickly covered all unpainted areas and some other details in a layer of dark aluminium and left it like this for the time being. I quickly detailed connective part of the armor and moved on because I would treat this very similar to the metal parts with a wash, so there was no use in investing a lot of time here. At this point I gave the Mini a coat of AK Interactive matte varnish because I wanted to work with decals. And I won't go through everything I did again because I just used the same methods I already covered in a couple of other videos, but after they were applied and integrated into the armor, I made sure to rough them up a bit more than usual. And I also redid the metal edges, because as you can see they got dulled down too much because the matte varnish just dissolved and muddied the graphite layers. I wanted to do an industrial base to fit the theme, and I have a couple of diamond plate patterned plastic cards that I could use, but Kill Team Octarios has these great tiles that I will use a lot for this style of base in the future. To be able to reuse them instead of cutting a part out and just being able to use this once, I'm making an Oyamara mold of a part that I liked, and then I cut it down to fit the base. This also created an additional level and not just a flat base, which I always find a lot more interesting. I filled some gaps with milliput, and when it was dry I just sanded the side of the base so it would look like one piece. So I started painting the base with the same Rhinoxide and black mix. After that I gradually built layers of textured blue, starting with an Incubi Darkness and Rhinoxide mix, and then using pure Incubi Darkness and slowly adding different blues. The goal was to have a ground plate that was painted blue but gradually got worn down and the darker layers showing through, in a similar way to the Marine. The paint on the raised diamond shapes would rub off first, of course, so I picked these out with a mix of Rhinoxide and Incubi Darkness, and then rubbed paint over the area where the dark and brighter blue were meeting to create additional texture and wear towards the edges. Again, using somewhat dry paint and rubbing it off the brush creates a pretty believable texture here. For this next step, others would probably use an oil wash, and that's perfectly fine, but as I said, I just prefer to do as much as possible with acrylics, and it works perfectly fine anyway. I'm using a mix of burnt umber ink and scrag brown to create brown discolorations and to draw all effects together. Adding more and more scrag brown and applying a few layers covering less area, we can simulate rust spots in the recesses or around the bolts or wherever else water would collect. Picking out the edges with a bit of metallic paint and some last pure scrag brown layers finishes the base. Using a really similar mix but adding a tiny bit of orange to achieve even more saturation, I'm going to define the chest eagle. And here I don't necessarily imagine this being rust, but rather some discoloration of the alloy that it's made of. And as a stylistic choice, it helps to create black edges on the rest of the eagle, which fits with the rest of the theme. Ultimately, it's just a way to create visual interest, and for me it looks pretty good. What else do we need? I mixed in more and more scrag brown and a little orange and made sure the washes stayed in the recesses to achieve these dark edges that I later could apply some metallics to. And I added a few glazes of this mix to the black trims and also stained the metal parts in the same way. I also realized that the white skull on the knee pad looked a bit one-dimensional, so I was giving it a layer of color towards the lower area to add a bit of a shade color. Initially I said I don't want my Grimdark to rely too heavily on dirt effects, but adding something that resembles dust helps to create an additional layer. Here I went for a bright beige dust and I'm mixing some Easy Desert with a random off-white I had standing on the table. After I checked my consistency, I just went ahead and let it run into recesses, because this is where we expect dirt to collect more undisturbed. Then using very diluted layers of paint, I built a couple of layers over the feet. You can decide how far up you want to go, but I didn't want to overdo the effect, so I stopped under the knees. Some of you will ask, why not use pigments for this? And of course this would be a viable strategy. If I can do an almost identical effect with a brush, I'll do it. I just like to push my pigment suspended in a nice and wet acrylic medium. And I just feel like I have more control over what is going on, and the result that I get with this looks just as good and maybe even better. Next it's time to add some wear and damage to the black parts, and you can see that I use my thumbnail to make sure I have just enough paint on the brush to leave very thin lines and dots. And I add small chips of Vallejo metal airbrush color steel to exposed areas on the eagle, like the front of the skull and the edges of the feathers, and also the edges of the trims on the shoulder guards. Additionally, I'm picking out some edge highlights on the metals and wherever I feel like the red armor would benefit from a bit more readability. I wanted the eyes to complement the generally dark theme, like two lights peeking out of the darkness. And to achieve that, I placed the highlights relatively centered on the lenses. That means centered if you're looking at it right from the front. And I gave the recesses a wash with contrast warp lightning to mimic a green glow. But this just adds a bit of smoothness to the gradient. Then I painted a reflection on the edge below, with the brightest place in the middle corresponding to the position of the highlight on the lens. The last thing to do was to paint details like the purity seals on the pouches, and to stick to the rough and gritty theme, I just painted the highlights in a textured way, like here on the pouch on his back for example. And here I should have said, and this is the result. But right then, I dropped the mini and broke an arm and a finger. The arm was an easy fix, but the finger, forever gone in the void that is my carpet. Or even more likely, it ended up inhaled by a cat. This unfortunate episode made me realize that I was not careful enough because I was rushing through painting this mini to finish the video by Friday. And it made me realize that being on a schedule doesn't necessarily make my videos better. It certainly doesn't make my painting better, so from now on the videos will release when they're done. I'll still do my best to make one video every other week, but it won't release on the same day always. So maybe now more than ever, it's a good idea to subscribe to the channel to not miss an upload. But it won't release on the same day always. So maybe now more than ever, it's a good idea to subscribe to the channel to not miss an upload. Because I get a lot of requests on how to adapt my tutorials more towards speed, here's a few thoughts on what you can do. You can only sponge on the layers and not do a lot or any of the brush work. You could limit the amount of layers. Maybe you can do the initial Rhinoxide and black mix and then just use one layer of Mephiston red and the last one with Evil Sun Scarlet. You can dry brush the edges if you want to darken them again. Dry brush the eagle and the trims where I used more controlled texturing and then just slap on a wash of your desired color. And of course you would be doing batch painting. Just because I'm not batch painting because I don't want to and I don't have to, it doesn't mean you can't do it. This reduces drying times to non-existent and it will automate your processes through muscle memory and repetition. But here's a counter proposal. How about you don't speed things up for once and you just have fun with creating and trying something new? It's okay to enjoy your painting time and not feel like it's a job you need to rush through to get to the next step, which is. And guess what? In the end, you won't need to ask how to speed this up because you will be faster through having practiced this 50 times. It's only slow and difficult the first few times, until you worked out the details and quirks. Welcome to everything else in the world you can learn. Try doing a handstand if you never did one before, and you will get what I mean.
Good luck nailing that on the first try.
This backpack is a good example. By the time I got to it, I knew the limitations and strengths of my tools and ways to apply paint from painting the armor. Like I knew what patterns I would get and how much space I could realistically cover with my sponge and where I needed to revert back to brushwork. And I also learned to make the effect more visible, I have to give the edges a few strokes of black before I added the rubbed off metal edges. And here's the result. It was interesting to try something new and I hope you're inspired to not only try this approach to painting, but also are eager to find your own ways of pushing that pigment that will make you leave your comfort zone and have fun in the process. I learned a lot painting this Blood Angel and I hope you learned a lot watching me learn too. If you want to help me to be able to continue making videos, remember to like this one, and if you're not subscribed yet, smash that red button under the video, and tonight you will sleep the sleep of the righteous with the knowledge that you helped someone tremendously. All of this process will be available again in long form and more detailed on my Patreon in October, and don't forget that you can find about 170 additional video tutorials and PDFs on there as well. All of them will help you learn new painting tricks and how to enjoy painting a lot more. On screen you can see the names of my current video supported tier patrons. Thanks a lot to all of my patrons as well as my YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers for allowing me to do what I do. Thanks for watching and remember, don't be afraid, it's only paint.
My last Grimdark Space Marine video was received rather well. We got a decent amount of views, but more importantly, a lot of you tried the style out on their own. Some stuck to the approach directly, some adapted it and changed around a few things to where it better fit what they had in mind, and some even applied it to new chapters already. When I asked for these pictures, I got over 250 responses in just one day. So many I can't even put them all on screen, and I'm sorry if yours is not showing. But it was really great to see that so many of you got inspired to try something new and had fun doing so. It was really motivating to hear some of your stories, so thanks a lot for all the submissions. A little bit earlier, I also asked which chapter you would like to see next, and I was eager to start on the next video in this series, because if I'm honest, it's a lot of fun to paint this way, so in anticipation of the result, I started an outro ring. I would be able to talk about how blues and red-browns create an interesting color contrast, how we don't have to care about chalkiness with this approach, I haven't painted anything blue in a long while, and everyone just loves ultramarines in general, right? Wrong. So most of you wanting to see black Templars or a black version of this gave me a bit of a headache. The reason why this approach is working on colors other than black is that there's a form of contrast in this. Not in the traditional bright edge highlights on dark colorway, but because there's a dark, almost black outline on a relatively bright surface, and that also creates readability. But how do we create dark edges on an already black armor? Maybe I'd have to adapt my approach a bit. Already before I started, I knew that I needed to adapt the base color.
Because like I said, it wasn't an option to darken the worn edges to create contrast this time, I had to go brighter. I also wanted more red in the base color. Obviously that wasn't an option last time, but I thought it would be fitting for the black, so I used mahogany brown. I don't know any direct equivalent for this in Citadel colors, but you can just use any mahogany brown. There's one in almost every paint range. Or you can just mix a color that you like from reds and browns. It doesn't have to be precisely the same color. It won't make that much of a difference. Just find a color you like personally and that isn't too dark. Remember, our main color is black, so we need something that contrasts against it. You can see that I also add some scrag brown so that I get brighter spots and some variety for the underpainting. This color was going to give me bright edges after we applied the black, while keeping the weathered and spotty look. Next it was time to figure out the best way to apply the black. What I was looking for is a great looking pattern that is easy and quick to do, while also letting the brown shine through enough. I started by brush, and you can see that I switch opacities a bit to see what makes sense. In the end, I didn't quite like the result, so back to the sponge. As always, I start in the center of a panel, press down harder and then go a little easier as I move towards the outside. There's definitely a period in all of this where I need to experiment, because all colors and hues have different properties and are going to behave and interact slightly different with the base color too. But I have to say, finding this new approach to painting and to create my own world within the 40k universe has been a lot of fun and extremely rewarding. And I'll be honest, that was exactly what I needed. Because full-time content creation has been a bit of a roller coaster of ups and downs, and I'm still highly motivated and I'm enjoying it. Sometimes you just feel like everything that can go wrong will go wrong. I'm looking at you, Rhino Arc 2. This piece of garbage arrived straight up broken. It won't even turn on properly, and if it does, the motor does not move at all. What I learned about myself over the years is that whenever things aren't working exactly the way I want them to work, I get this anxious mood that diminishes my quality of life and also makes me unproductive. Luckily, I found something that helps me reset whenever I'm in this mood, and this video's sponsor, Premium Jane, can do exactly the same thing for you. A few drops of CBD now and then, when I feel the anxiety creeping up, helps me to get into a calmer state of mind, and I can focus properly on what is important and on the things that I need to get done. I've been using CBD for that purpose for years now, and that's why I'm happy that Premium Jane, one of the leading CBD product companies in the US, decided to sponsor this video, and they're also offering a massive 25% discount for my viewers. Premium Jane CBD products are third-party laboratory tested, completely vegan, contain only natural ingredients, and are made purely from hemp grown in the United States. Like I said, CBD oil has helped me get my calmness back whenever I was in stressful, anxiety-inducing situations. I've also used CBD gummies after my 3 knee surgeries to get back on track and working out again faster. Definitely go and check Premium Jane's website. They have all the additional information you need to know about their products and CBD in general, and their store has many more products beside the ones I use, available for different applications and purposes. And if you shop through my link in the description, and if you use the coupon code Travarion on checkout, you'll get a 25% discount while also supporting me and this channel in the process. So thanks again, Premium Jane, for sponsoring this video, and consider giving this a try if my experience sounds relatable to you. Now, back to the video. I knew I'd be doing the shoulders in white, so this was a good place to try and find the best patterns and to get into a good groove for the sponging. Whenever I had troubles reaching with the sponge, or if an area was too small for it, I'm switching to the brush to apply the black. I find this process extremely relaxing and enjoyable. It's really satisfying to see the patterns build up in a credible way, and it's also really fast, which makes you feel like you're making quick progress. I almost feel the pattern looks best on the shoulders, probably because I didn't have to worry about anything there, so maybe the key to the best result is not to worry, and to just apply the patterns quickly and decisively. Because sponging gave me the best looking results, as you just saw, I was using it a lot. However, that means sacrificing some control over where the paint goes sometimes. So I cleaned up some of the edges where they got covered too much, because for my plan to work, I needed them to stay bright. And here and there I also tweaked the patterns a bit, like on the side of the shin guards. Now the main color was in place and I was ready to move to the next step. But painting black is always tricky. You need to leave a certain amount of black paint visible so it reads as black, but you also need to highlight it. The seemingly obvious choice of gray usually gives really boring results, so I went with Dark Reaper, which is slightly blue, and later I'd be using Wolf Gray for the last highlights. A general tip I have when you are going for highlights: start with a conservative mix, don't go too bright too quick. So here I was mixing just a tiny bit of Dark Reaper into the black and stippled on the first layer of light catching onto the black surface. And remember, you can use the sponge for this. I just went with the brush because I like to control my paint and I don't want to just have speed paints in my cabinet. The way you apply the paints and how fast you do it is all up to you. I'm just showing you my version. Think back to the intro and how many people successfully adapted the first video to their needs and desired results. Take ownership of the way you paint with this. I know you can do it, and it's just so much fun to find your own way of something someone else showed you and in seeing it all come together. I'm highlighting all of the individual features in a way that we call volumetric highlighting, which means you break down all the shapes on your miniature into geometrical objects, which is relatively simple on Space Marine, and you just study how light behaves on these objects and you replicate that on the mini itself. I talk more about this in my Over at Myrmidon skin video if you're interested. So this gives me a guideline of where to place the highlights, and I just keep stippling the paint on, establishing the light situation on the Marine. I'm leaving enough black to still show, so the mini won't look grey, but instead would still read as black. The stippling also gives me the texture I wanted, and it makes everything a little easier when creating transitions, since we don't care about smoothness and our brain does the rest. Eventually I'm going brighter by adding wolf grey. The next highlight goes straight in the middle of the last one, and then I expand it outwards. And the good thing is, whenever I have the feeling that I went too bright, I can just add a couple of dots of darker color and even out the transitions. I gave all of these shapes the same treatment, stippling on the volumetric highlights. I tried to emphasize all of the inverted edges as much as I could, because there was no chance to do the traditional contrast building on black with grey on the edges. All of these shapes needed to be a bit brighter. Remember, we need to exaggerate a lot in mini painting, because we want the viewer to believe that this is a real Space Marine and not just a toy soldier. So I'm putting in these confined specular highlights of almost pure wolf grey in places that are believable. It's really important to keep them confined. Making these last highlights too wide is the classic situation that leads to chalky results. And of course, too much of the bright colors and our armor won't read as black anymore. For the weapons, I went for the traditional red, and I painted it exactly the same way I did on the Blood Angel's armor from the last video. So you know where to go if you want to catch up on that and see it done more in detail. So here we are. Even though I was a little worried in the beginning, I still think this worked out. Maybe a bit far on the gray side, but I think it just plays into the worn out surface of the armor, and the brown separating the panels better than I expected. However, I feel like it's still missing something, so you know what we need. Metal edge highlights. The reflective nature of the metallic pigments creates a great edge highlight effect, and I think its brightness relativizes the gray highlights and makes them look a lot darker and the armor more black again. I also added metal to the chains and the eagle on the chest, and some other details I wanted to resemble metal. I'll come out of the closet and admit today that I really hate metallic golds. Layer Metallics only has one gold and I don't really like the tone. And I don't want to use the alcohol-based golds that exists. And most other acrylic golds I just hate the consistency of. So I cheated a bit, used regular metallics as a base, and mixed a color tone I liked from acrylic inks. Here I was using a mix of burnt sienna and a yellow ink, and I just stained the metallics with the resulting color. And I strategically placed some shadows to define the shapes a bit. Then I gave it one more glaze of a darker mix. I just used a bit more burnt sienna. That's it. That's my gold done. Infuriatingly simple, I know. I almost felt sad painting over the texture on the shoulder guards. I'm definitely going to make a mental snapshot of this and pull it out of storage when I find something it will be fitting for. So this is another experimental phase, because I had a rough idea of where I wanted to go with the white, but no real plan how to get there. The goal was to have the brown below to show through in a particular way, and I thought it would be best to do it in a similar way to the black. But there's a particular way that stippling bright colors over dark tones results in this gray desaturated mess, and I kept covering more and more area with Screaming Skull to avoid this. Eventually I arrived at a result that had just slightly dark discoloration showing, and I highlighted that with a mix of Screaming Skull and white. But this ended up looking too clean and too bright, and that's not what I wanted. So how can I get from this to where I want it to be? Which was a grainy, almost textured look. I started with adding back texture by sponge and brush. But it all really went nowhere until I added chips and cracks by brush on the outer areas of the white, and it finally felt like I had a plan. I kept adding different sizes of chips to the inner areas and then made the outer parts more worn. This is my favorite part of painting. I basically had no idea, but I inched forward to where I wanted to be. You can always repaint areas, experiment and have fun. Eventually I found the right mix of detail. Larger chips went on by sponge, smaller ones with the brush tip, and even smaller ones using a dry brush motion, and ultimately I think this combination is what sells the effect. To add more variation, I also started to make this area a bit darker, so I added black to the mahogany brown. In general, I realized that having darker and brighter chips would sell the effect better. I think it's important to switch up your tools when you do this. While sponges give a good variety of chip size and shape, the brush gives you more control. Here you can see how I increase the density near the black trim with white brush strokes. And here I'm using a relatively dry brush to add the very tiny and dark specks. See how my brush sprays and applies multiple dots, which stains all of the surface a bit and draws everything together. Wherever I felt like the density was too much, I sponged on some bright color again, and I'm using the sponge because it leaves more opaque dots and we don't get the graying effect I mentioned earlier. I'm not gonna talk about how I edit the decals, you can see that in so many other videos I made already, but I shifted away almost completely from freehanding my own chapter symbols ever since I found this approach, which really lets me integrate the symbols and gives them a painted on look. And when they were done, of course they looked slightly too clean compared to the rest, so I banged them up with Screamer Skull and Mahogany Brown. I went really hard on that, but you can of course add as much or as little of the effect as you want. A slight color shift with Scrag Brown rounds out the white, and I thought about adding purple here and there, but then I chickened out. I also banged up all of the other decals I added so they would appear more alive and part of the armor. For the tabard, I wanted something very simple but effective. I knew I wanted to play with transparency of color here, so I added a color shift of brown to the lower end of the cloth, simply by glazing on a bit of mahogany onto the black. Using very similar colors for different elements ties them together and makes the final result look more uniform. I don't mind the spotty finish because smoothness and the surfaces looking too equal is not the end goal anyway. Moving on again, I was using colors I already had on the palette, which was Dark Reaper and Screaming Skull. I mixed a beige gray that I could shift from a cool blue gray to a warmer beige color. I worked the mix into the surface, starting more opaque at the top, which is where I wanted the paint to be brighter and more solid and more opaque, and faded the layer as I moved down so the brown could shine through. Next I added more Screaming Skull and worked on the highlights. Again, more solid layers in the areas I wanted much brighter, and then as I moved down I worked with less opaqueness. And I also used the line pattern to create more interest on the cloth. I did this 2 more times, covering less in this area. And I also put a less bright highlight on the inside of the deeper fold. I really like how the cooler shadows interact with the slightly warm highlights, and how the result has this great look of a white robe, but has tons of color variation in it, without using any of the classic "here's how you paint a white robe" approaches. And the great thing is, all of this took about 10 minutes, which just shows how a little knowledge and practice eventually turns everyone into a speed painter, even with just regular acrylics. Among the last details left to do were the belts, and again I just started from the black as a shade color and highlighted the edges with mahogany. Adding lines and texture creates the feeling of a black cracked leather. Grimdark to me is about wearing down of gear, so I'm going wild with this. Of course you can tone down this effect again as much as you want. A few highlight steps followed by adding more scrag brown, and a last one just using pure scrag brown. Overall the chest eagle felt a bit too bright, so I added a layer of thinned down scrag brown to it and made the outline more pronounced by shading it with a thin line of black. I also used watered down black to shade the metal parts. I thought about doing the eyes in a purple color or the regular red that is used a lot for Black Templars, or even yellow. Damn, now I really wish I made them yellow. But I went for the green I use for most of my Marines. I guess I just like them to all share this feature. There's a complete description for how I did this in the Blood Angels video, so I'll not go too much into detail. I just wanted to create a subtle glow effect again. I wanted to do a quick snow base for this, so I started with creating a few different textures on the base by using watered down PVA glue and different grain sizes of basing sand. Once it was dry, I applied a black base coat. I was experimenting with liquid pigments for a while now, and I was looking for a use for the white dust, and obviously snow was the first thing that came to mind. When I only applied the white, it didn't quite have the look I was looking for, but then I combined it with the turquoise oxide as a base, and I was surprised how great it looked. So on top of a layer of the oxide, I put a thin layer of the white pigment and repeated the process where I wanted more coverage. I also covered some recesses on the feet with it to integrate the mini and the base. On top of the white I put patches of snow texture, and I also put some specks on the feet and lower parts of the armor and the tabard. Obviously we want our mini to look like it's part of its surroundings and that it's interacting with it. And this is a good way to do this. Ready for the final showcase? Here we go. Again, I'm super happy that I tried this way of painting and that you guys reacted so positively to it. It allows me to paint my favorite 40k miniatures, which is Space Marines, don't judge me. And I'm super eager to try this technique for all of these fancy colors of my favorite chapters. And don't worry, I have tons of video ideas lined up, but let me know in the comments which one you would like to see next. And I'll do the chapter or color that gets the most votes in the next installment of this series. Special thanks to all of my patrons. You're the ones making these videos possible. If you want to join the gang, if you want to support me and get perks like feedback for your miniatures on my Discord server, show up in the credits of my videos, and all of the super instructional Patreon videos and PDFs to take your painting to the next level, follow the link in the description of the video. For now, thanks for watching, and remember, don't be afraid, it's only paint. Painting black is always tricky. You need to leave a certain amount of black paint visible. The reflective Sponsored by Epic Basing. Link and discount code in the description. Whenever I asked my fellow pigment pushers what color it is they have the most trouble with, yellow is always pretty high on the list. But why is yellow such a hard color? In today's video, I want to answer age-old questions like how the hell do you paint yellow without applying 300 layers? And is there really no way to paint a decent looking yellow without a pink undercoat? Welcome back to How to Paint Grimdark. In this series, I'm painting miniatures in a Grimdark style, trying not to rely on the typical utilities like streaking grime and oil washes. For this episode, I chose Imperial Fists because I mostly did dark colors so far and I wanted to work with a bright color next. And since Games Workshop came out with a paint that makes painting yellow really easy, I thought it would be a good idea to combine the two topics. A lot of the struggle with yellow comes from how long it takes to get a consistent layer done to work off of. But applying Imperial Fist yellow over a white base coat makes the step really easy, and on top of that we end up with a really bright and intense yellow. Here's the example why I don't like using transparent colors over zenithal. I was a bit sloppy with the white base coat application and it left some dark parts shining through. White leaves a very particular speckling, especially on smoother surfaces that just don't appeal to me. And since the contrast paints are only staining and not opaque, the speckling remains visible. And sure, it speeds things up, but to me, this always looks unfinished. I quickly fixed a small hiccup with a layer of Uriel yellow that I sprayed on just enough to cover the speckling. Next, I wanted to find the proper shade color for the Imperial Fist yellow, so I laid out a few of the new and some of the old contrast paints. You can see that we have a couple of options. Some are a bit more yellow, some darker shades of brown, some are a bit orange, and some lean a bit more towards red. All of these colors are valid options to shade yellow in my opinion. You just got to decide if you want your result to look more red, or a less saturated brown shade, or just a darker yellow. I decided to go with Nastreg yellow and whipped out the airbrush. I thinned the contrast paint about 50-50 with AK acrylic thinner and sprayed on the shadows from below. I guess you could say that I pulled an anti-zenithal, going to a maximum angle of about 45 degrees to keep the yellow highlights, as you can see here. The contrast paint still pools in the same way it would look like when applied with a brush, but we get the added benefit of really smooth transitions to the yellow. You can do this with a brush, but it takes a bit more time and you will have to babysit the contrast paint a lot more. With this initial light situation established, I still needed to create more contrast across all of the panels and features, so I mixed a wash of snakebite leather and contrast medium. A lot of you ask me for exact ratios whenever I use these washes, but the thing is, there's no optimal ratio here, because you might like your mix darker than me or lighter. My recommendations in situations like these is, if you are unsure, it's always good to start more diluted, as that is easier to fix by simply darkening everything with another layer of the wash once the first one is dry. And for the next try, you know that you can start a bit darker. And as you can see, that's exactly what I did on the foot here. You can also see that sometimes I correct some of the gradients by wiping away excess color from the highlights with a brush dipped into pure contrast medium. At this point, I wanted to experiment with another one of the new paints, the new formulated Fuegan orange shade, using it as a bit of a color shift filter for the lower areas, like the legs and on the backpack. I wanted to see how well it does what the new shades are marketed as, barely staining the highlights and drying more confined in the recesses. And I don't know, it doesn't look bad, but honestly, they're not revolutionary in my opinion. You can't quite modulate the results as much as you can with these contrast washes that I'm using, since most of the new washes are rather thin, out of the pot, and don't darken the surfaces a lot, even in the recesses. And I feel like that's a problem because it doesn't really speed things up. Whenever I wanted darker shadows or panel lines, I switched to more or less undiluted Caracasure and try to apply it into the recesses directly. I typically do this for deeper recesses, like on the slits on the peak, or anything that is facing down and would be darker naturally from cast shadows, like here in the backpack. At this point, I decided to give all metal parts an initial layer of William Metal airbrush color, dark aluminium, and I also applied the first layers of black to the gun casing and all the straps. Of course, you can wait with this until the yellow is finished, but sometimes I want to see where the end result is going before I put in the last steps on the main cup. If this was a general Imperial Fist video, I would mix ice yellow and Uriel yellow as a highlight color at this point and start to bring out the edges and some of the highlights. The lower they are on the mini, I would use more Uriel yellow, and the higher up, the more ice yellow I would mix in. For any of you pigment pushers that are not afraid of non-premixed colors, similar results can be achieved by just adding different amounts of white to the Uriel yellow. My initial inspiration was the illustrations on the Horus Heresy box, so I started roughing up the edges with a brown shade, but quickly transitioned into a mix of gray and a little bit of brown because I felt like I didn't need the extra transition step from yellow to brown and could go straight into gray. To create the effect I wanted, I ran the brush across edges, and then whenever the paint dried in a bit, I would drag and rub it across the surface to create scratch patterns, but also small specks of rubbed off paint. The more dried in your paint is, the better this works. And as always, when I try new things, I did it a bit more carefully and confined in the beginning to see where it's going, and then went a bit harder. As the gray builds up on the edges, you'll notice how the readability and contrast increases, and I really like this approach. However, I wanted to take this one step further. So I took the mix I recommended for edge highlighting and applied some chipping, starting at the edges and extending the battle damage wherever I wanted more chip paint to show up. If you want to learn more about the proper paint consistency and other important things to do while chipping with a sponge, you can watch the video I made about it on my channel. The idea here was to make the paint look like it rubbed off only a bit initially, and then exposing some kind of primer and only eventually coming off completely and have the ceramide shine through in these areas. Again, you could decide that you only want to do the gray and get some really nice looking results with great contrast and battle damage at the same time, but I wanted to combine both approaches to show you the full range of possibilities here. Once I was happy with the initial patterns of the chipping, I went back to the brush. I do this for a couple of reasons. The first one being I want to make the chipped areas a bit bigger, so I have more room for applying the darker paint later, and this is a bit more precise. The second is that I can create more variety in the patterns. And third, instead of painting dedicated highlights, I can make areas lighter where highlights would be, for example, the upper side of the beak. And last but not least, I have more control in smaller areas like the elbow here, where the sponge can't quite reach and would just make a mess. If you want to speed things up, of course it's up to you to just use the sponge, but this is the way I enjoy doing it, and I also prefer the results combining the sponge and the brush gives. Next, I'm filling in the gray, following the patterns I established with the bright yellow paint. And you can see that I'm using a smaller brush for this because the bristles are stiffer than on my usual Raphael size 1, which gives me a lot more control over where the paint goes. I was using decals again for the chapter and unit markings, and I put them on in the usual way with microset and microsol. Only this time I did not use paint to bang them up, but I took a hard blunt object to scratch off parts of the decal once it was completely dry. I'm using my trusty sculpting tool here, but I recommend using a toothpick instead, because wood isn't as sturdy as metal and you will have a bit of an easier time not running into the danger of scratching off the paint layer below. I just couldn't find any toothpicks in the moment. After I gave all of the decals the same treatment, I gave the metallics a thick wash of burnt umber ink. The goal was to create an opaque layer with only the edges showing. Basically, I imagine this metal, whether that's for it to look less reflective in the field or something building up over time, I leave it up to your imagination. But this is a great way to build contrast. I also used the umber ink to create shadows on the underside of the rivets on the shoulder, as well as some separation between the elements. And after all that was done, brought the edges out again with some pure dark aluminium. And finally, I also added some scratches and wear to the more exposed areas. I wasn't super inspired on the black parts, so I went for a relatively simple black with typical highlight patterns and edge highlights. If you want to see more options, you can check out the other Grimdark videos for additional ways to paint these that also suit the style. Here I'm just going for some contrast by making sure the areas stay darker next to the edge highlights, and then adding small scratch marks and wear and tear. Last but not least, I'm giving all edges facing up an extra layer of this brighter gray. Another new product I wanted to try is the AK enamel pigments. Instead of using my regular acrylics, I wanted to see if I could use them to do rust and streaks of rust. And I had a bit of a mixed result. I started by mixing the dark and light rust and applied it around the rivets. I like that they sort of flow outward and create a bit of a gradient as they spread out, as opposed to regular acrylic paints. I also tried some streaking, and here I'm a bit torn, as it's really easy to get smooth results, especially as you can smooth out the outer areas with mineral spirits, but the end result is definitely not as bright as acrylic paint. So overall, I like the result, but I think there's probably better applications for this that I just haven't found yet. For the base, I used epicbasing.com's new Urban Rubble set. This set came just in time for Horus Heresy, and it's really amazing. They showed what they did for a few of the flying characters from Marvel Crisis Protocol, and I was just blown away. I 3D printed all of their available elements a couple of times, so I would have some good variety to choose from, and then got to work. I knew I needed a relatively narrow base for the idea I had in mind, so I didn't go too crazy with the bigger elements. And I also wanted to use this manhole as one of the eye catchers on the base, but I also needed a feature that would stand out. The more sophisticated pre-made pillar rubble would probably be a bit too big in this case, so I built my own feature from some of the filler elements, a couple of T-beams spread out over some concrete rubble, and I used a blob of epoxy clay to hold it all in place and give it a bit of extra bulk. And then I arranged the broken concrete floor elements around that and also the manhole. Thanks a lot to epicbasing.com for sponsoring this video. They're always one of the easier integrations, since I would be using their stuff even if they didn't sponsor a video, but don't tell them. They're running a promotion where the first 50 people to click the link in the description will get a 13% discount on both physical orders and the STL files. And I don't think they ever gave discounts on the STL files before, so this is a really great deal. Their products cover a wide range of possible terrain, rock formations, trees, bushes, crystals, and magic features, and the urban set fits right in with their system. These larger features can be placed on some dynamic groundwork, and the filler elements create transitions between the ground and the features, and that feels supernatural and realistic. The good thing is you can just mix and match all the elements, like you can use the vegetation fillers on your urban features and groundwork and so on. There are no boundaries here. If you like what you see, follow the link in the description and grab a discount while it lasts. To finish my base, I glued all of the floor tiles in place and filled some of the bigger cracks with smaller parts that I cut off from the bigger clusters. To fill the gaps and draw everything together, I used some structure paste. I'm using AK Interactive, but whatever you have at home works. To paint the base, I used the beige gray that I washed with dark gray to create some depth. And then I added another wash of burnt umber to add color variation and painted most of the metal elements. I added some rust colors to the metal areas and around them and painted the T-beams rust color too. And then using my gray beige base color, I dry brushed some edges again and also painted highlights on the beams by gradually adding lighter rust colors and eventually a bit of beige. Running everything out with a last layer of bright rust on the manhole. At this point it was time to pin the mini to the base, so I could add 2 more finishing touches. Like I explained in the first episode of the series, Grimdark to me is more than using a certain type of colors or using a particular set of techniques. It's also about telling stories that define the grim settings and situations these characters are in. And that's why I decided to add some blood to the bayonet. To me, a clear red is always a good choice for blood, and I mixed it with dark brown ink to shift the color more towards realistic blood. You could also use black. Just try finding a mix that works for you. Once I was happy with the shade of the color, I added some clear uhu glue, which allows me to create strings of blood and gore. I stirred the mix until I was happy with the consistency. It's totally okay for the purpose if it ends up a bit grainy. Our guy here probably did not conduct a clean surgery. The goal is to stir the mix until you can pull these strings. However, you can also stir too long, as you can see here, because the blob I picked up is not sticking to the base. Don't worry, it takes a bit of practice to find the perfect middle way, and once my mix was perfect, I snapped a bit onto the base and also added a blob to the bayonet. Then I pulled most of the material I added to the blade down until the 2 pulls connected. To make the scene extra gory, I added some more of the blood to the blade and the base, but be careful, it's easy to overdo the effect. To tie the mini and its surroundings together even more, I went back to the AK liquid pigments. Particularly, I wanted to try these white dust pigments, but somehow the mix was too thin, even though I shook and stirred the pot for a couple minutes. It's easy to overdo pigments, but unfortunately this pre-made mix did not leave any visible traces. It was kind of weird. I happen to have the exact version of this pigment in dry form, so I added them to the liquid pigments and generously slapped them on the base. I went ahead and also brushed a thinner mix of this on the feet of the Space Marine, but initially it was hard to tell how much coverage I would get with this, so I ended up overdoing the effect. That means I had to brush off most of the pigments with White Spirit again, which took a few steps, but ultimately I arrived at a result that I liked. The idea was that he would be walking through fresh rubble, so there would be a good portion of dust present. A real good portion of dust. Last but not least, I filled in the eye lenses with blue. I don't want to drag the video out too long. Most of you will already know how this is done, but if you want to learn how to paint lenses and gems like this, don't forget that I have a video that explains all steps in detail on the channel. I'll leave a link in the description. To add a tiny bit of variety to the bolter, I added some subtle metal chips, and that was about it. While I show you some footage of the result, let me just quickly mention that if you like the video, you can support more videos like this on my Patreon, which gives you access to a full catalog of online lectures about how to improve your mini painting, no matter what level you are at. It also gives you access to the Discord. These pigment pushers are already a part of our great community. Why not join as well? I hope you liked this approach. It was fun to find a really easy and quick recipe for a traditionally hard color like yellow, and at the same time experiment with 2 or actually 3 if you combine both chipping techniques. Anyways, I hope you had fun watching. Let me know what you think of the result. And don't forget, don't be afraid, it's only paint. When I kicked off my Grimdark series with this Blood Angel, I did not expect that hundreds of people would like it so much that they wanted to try it out on their own miniatures. When I asked my viewers to submit their results 2 months after the release of the video, I was blown away by the response. I received over 300 submissions. Of course, it never had the reach or impact that Slapchop had because it's way more niche, but it still made me extremely happy that there was so much positive response. When I heard about Slapchop, I thought it was just the latest buzzword in mini painting that someone made up for marketing purposes. Stuff like that happens all the time, and I didn't research it any further. But then I realized that this was just something that someone came up with to speed up their painting and, even more importantly, to have fun with painting.
Really not bad for a few hours work, and it's so fun and easy to do.
And isn't this exactly what we should aim for when painting? Making it feel fun and not like a chore. Just like Slapchop, my Grimdark approach was not something new, as it merely combined already existing techniques and brushstrokes to create a vision, a desired end result. And for me, that end result was something like this, which is a large-scale ultramarine created by Chris Clayton years ago, who won multiple Slayer swords. Obviously, this ultramarine borrows techniques from scale modeling like the salt technique to create weathered blue armor and something a little more innovative when using some sort of crackle medium for the white shoulder guard. All of this is not necessarily compatible with the Warhammer 40k scale, so I had to come up with different ways to create something similar. These marines with battered armors, captured in the middle of long crusades, no rest, no time to restore their armors like they should, are just a combination of ideas that I wanted to combine into a result that I had in mind, that I would enjoy painting and that I would be happy with when finished. Just like my Blood Angel, I started this ultramarine from a black base coat and gave it a base layer of brown, some very dark brown. And then I moved on to applying the typical blues that are associated with ultramarines. But one thing I learned during painting all of these different chapters is that you need to adapt the approach when switching out the main colors. So here, instead of going for the almost black underpainting that worked for the Blood Angel, I realized that I had to do something different for this ultramarine. Don't get me wrong, this looks perfectly fine if you like it, and I could have stained all the edges with a red brown like I show here, but for the sake of a start to finish tutorial, I completely started over. One thing I noticed over the years is that I'm weird when it comes to art and artistic expression. My tastes and preferences constantly change, and that's why I'm always looking for new ways to paint my minis, and that's why I'm getting bored if my style doesn't constantly evolve. And this personality trait is also the reason why my walls have been relatively empty for the longest time. I just can't decide. I also hate committing to one style when it comes to hanging art on my walls. Of course, I'm a self-absorbed YouTuber, that's why I put my own art there, but what if I want them to look different tomorrow? I also hate permanent mounting systems. These are basically glued on, and I don't want to drill into my walls either. This is concrete. And what if I mess up the mounting and I'm stuck with a tilted picture forever? Luckily, this video's sponsor Displate has swooped in to solve all of these problems for me. Let's appreciate the freaking quality on these for a second. The The prints are amazing, sharp and crisp, and they are done on these metal canvases that just snap to your walls due to their amazing mounting system. They feature designs by many pop culture staples as well as over 40,000 different artists, which means you can choose from over 1 million designs, so you'll never get bored staring at your walls again.
Are you staring at your wall again?
No. Finally, I can unleash my inner nerd. I put some of the greatest artworks that have influenced me over the years on my walls. The good thing is, if I ever get bored, I can just replace them with other designs in a few seconds. Mounting your displays is super easy. Just clean the walls with these wipes they sent you, stick the leaf on, and place the magnet on top. Ready to go. The unique mounting system will let you adjust the plates easily, which makes crooked pictures on the wall a thing of the past. I also got this cute little tiger motif for my son's room, and as he grows and his interests change, we can switch them out until he finally realizes that this is the best stuff to put on your walls. If you want your walls to get a premium upgrade as well, you can check out Displate and browse the multitude of awesome designs using my link in the description to receive up to 37% off of your purchase. And besides your wall looking awesome from now on, you're also supporting this channel in the process. After I had my new base color applied, that would be the underpainting, which would create the weathering effect. I needed to build up the blues, and for the sake of contrast, since I can't quite shade all of this blue with wanting the brown to still show in the recesses and on the edges, I had to mix in a bit of Cantor blue with my cracked blue base layer. Using a sponge to apply the color helps with creating that weathered and battered paint effect, because it creates irregularity in the blue layer and leaves some of the brown to shine through. Wherever I couldn't reach with the sponge, or where using the sponge would destroy any layers that I already applied, I used the brush to stipple on my initial blue mix. It's harder to mimic the texture, but it's doable and also decently fast. Of course, if your main goal is speed, just stick to the sponge. Personally, I just like the control that the brush gives me in these situations, and generally I don't mind taking a bit longer. Next, I was using pure McCrack blue, and as you can see, I'm covering less area than before, and with each new layer I make sure that the previous layer shines through to achieve that irregular weathered feeling. Here I'm using the brush again, but of course you could just use the sponge instead. Just that initial first highlight layer shows how the final result will come together and how it looks really good with comparably little effort. Once I had all of the areas highlighted with this first layer, I switched to Calgar blue, again covering less and less area. And I make sure the shapes receive a credible highlight. Like on the shoulder guard, I'm applying the light more like you would on a spherical shape, and I give the leg highlights more typical for a cylindrical object. I'm making sure areas facing up receive more light, like the apex point here on this extension of the knee pad, and I do the same thing for the knee itself. For the final highlights, I needed a color that was significantly brighter, so I mixed Calgar blue with wolf gray, applied a few pixels with my sponge and checked whether or not it might be a bit too bright, and then adjusted the mix to where I was happy. Obviously, I can't use this as an edge highlight because for the weathered effect I needed these to remain dark. But I touched on all of these higher up parts and any flat areas that face directly up. And also a lot of these inverted edges where you would not expect a lot of mechanical damage. This layer is important because it adds a lot of the contrast that we need. It almost ties everything together, it makes the miniature come alive and feel like there is some actual light shining on this 3 meter tall giant. Just like when Slapchop entered the stage, the reactions I got to this technique were mixed. But who cares if someone on the internet doesn't like the way you paint your toy soldiers? It's always a good idea to stay open and see whether or not you can draw inspiration or value from a painting approach. And if you can't find any value in it, then that's perfectly fine too. There's tons of different ways to paint your minis, you just have to find the one that makes you happy. I gave both the chainsword and the bolt pistol casing a consistent layer of white and then started to create a pattern of bands on them with a dark grey mix. With the new Primaris Marines and especially their gear, I get less of an archaic vibe from them, but more the feeling of modern technology. Kind of like how sci-fi artists imagine weapons and fighting gear in the not so far future. And I took some inspiration for the colors and shapes of my freehands from these artworks. I wanted to use one of the new Strikeforce Agastus minis for this video, by the way, and do the rocket launches in this design, which would have been awesome, but I didn't get my hands on them until yesterday, and I just can't film and edit a video like this in one day. I really like the more high-tech neatness compared to the hazard stripes I used on other minis. If you want to see just the standard red casing on these weapons, you can watch my Black Templar video. Before adding more colors to this, I added some quick and basic chipping with a sponge, using the same color and then intensifying the wear by adding more to all of the edges. First dragging the brush along to leave some thinner lines, and then pressing the brush on harder on some parts to make these lines wider, just to have a bit more of a variety. Then using Contrast Imperial Fist, which is transparent, which makes it perfect for this job, I just stained the two stripes in the front yellow. Contrast paint being transparent, also retaining the chips, I just painted on, and generally makes adding this bit of yellow a matter of 10 seconds. At this point I also wanted to finish the decals before I move on to the next weathering step for the armor, because they would have to be integrated with that. I applied them to the shoulders and used microset and microsole like usually to make them conform to the shapes better, and then used matte varnish to knock down the shine and smooth out the surface. And then as usual I used some sponge chipping for that painted on effect. Next I gave all of the metallic parts, even the ones I wanted gold, like the chest eagle and the shoulder trims, a base layer of dark aluminium. If you watched my Black Templar video, then you know that I'm not a huge fan of gold metallics. So I developed a much simpler approach for my golds, which ironically also looks a lot better, at least in my opinion. So after applying a base layer of silver metallics, I stained them with a mix of contrast paint and inks for a deep and saturated rich gold tone. This works extremely well, and if you watch my last painted like the box art video, you saw that you can use a large variety of contrast paints or inks for doing this. Here I went for a mix that had more yellow in it, but an intense yellow base layer, and as I shaded the golds more, I added burnt sienna ink to add that orange-red hue. I also added some dark colors eventually, but more on that in a minute. One product I always wanted to try was the Vallejo model washes. They're still acrylics, because as you probably know, I don't want to use oils or enamels for my Grimdark minis, but they have some interesting properties as you are going to see here shortly. I started with a few washes over the dark areas of the blue armor, and I also washed the white parts of the weapons to give them some staining. However, the build-up was a bit slow, and I know that it says for light colors, but there was not a lot of stain even on these whites, which was a bit disappointing. I will give them one more try with the airbrush in the future, maybe that allows for more control and even application, but this just looked a bit lackluster. So to get closer to my desired result, which was to stain these particular areas with a more reddish tone, I added some burnt sienna ink to the Vallejo wash, which resulted in deeper shadows and richer color. One amazing property the model wash has though is that even if it looks dry, you can wipe it away again with a wet brush. And not forever, but at least for a while. Kind of like enamels can be wiped away with thinner. And this becomes especially convenient for cleaning up the highlights, while we can retain these blackened edges like you can see on the middle part of the abdominal armor, or on the shoulder guards and the top of the helmet. Like I said, I'd show you a tiny bit more in regards to the gold I painted. And here I added more sienna to the one wing of the eagle for more variety, as well as the trims to make them more colorful. While I had the paint on my brush, I also did some last touch-ups to the white parts, which were still a bit lackluster after the brown Vallejo wash. And to round out the weathered effect, I used white aluminium for some bright metallic highlights on the especially exposed areas of the armor. And also to create some really bright reflections on the gold parts. Using silver as a highlight on gold desaturates the highlights again, which makes it more appropriate for the Grimdark theme in my opinion. To finish up the mini, I quickly glued some soil to the base and covered it in one layer of paint plus a wash and a dry brushed highlight, and then drowned everything in pigments. I also dusted up the feet a bit. I always feel like this is a big part of Grimdark, making sure the mini looks like it's part of the environment it is in, which is usually dirt. I also quickly did the eyes in my usual pattern, starting with a dark green contrast wash and just highlighting the lenses in a pretty straightforward way, and then adding a very basic OSL effect on the edge of the eye sockets of the helmet. And here's the result. What do you think? Do you like or hate it? Should I have used Slapshot instead? And let me know which chapter I should do next. If you like this video and you want to see the origins of the style, you can check out my Blood Angels video. Or if you want to see this approach adapted to a bright base color, just click here. Thanks for watching, keep pushing that pigment, and see you next time. I'll be honest, I was a bit disappointed when the line came out and his guard was just a standard Blade Guard veterans. No fancy Dark Angels iconography, no hooded figures, no swords, only these stupid flaps on the legs. So after I got rid of them and cleaned out the sides of the armor, I also scraped away the nipple where the holster is supposed to go on. The truth is, apart from these few details, I really like these models. Their stoic stance and aesthetic tells me they're truly battle-hardened veterans, not easily rattled even by the most overwhelming enemy onslaught. I got rid of the trims on the shoulder guard because I always work heavily with decals, and I just really like the way plain shoulder guards look on Space Marines. I was going through my Dark Angels boxes, starting with Wrath of the Soulforged King, and as far back as Stark Vengeance, in search of hooded heads. But no luck. I don't even know if I used all of them, or if there simply weren't any to begin with. There are, of course, the Deathwing Knights, but the heads are made for Terminate armor, and some of them are plain stupid.
Brother, turn the lights back on, will you?
Fine. I'll do it myself. I took some epoxy clay. It might go to this magic sculpt, but you can use whatever works for you. Rolled it out on a sheet of glass, and making sure it's wet so nothing sticks, I created a thin sheet. Whatever clay you're using, you'll probably want to have it cure for a bit so you don't rip it. And then I cut it into a more suitable size and lifted it off the glass plate. I'd rather have some excess that I can cut away later than not having enough. After checking how much I really needed and cutting it down even more, I created the shape of the hood in the front using my color shaper. And after that, I made sure it looked more like a hood by sculpting some folds and adding some volume in the back. I try to really push YouTube content lately, but there's a huge elephant in the room. On average, only 20% or less of a video I release gets watched, and I think this hurts the channel growth massively, as YouTube understandably does not recommend videos that have low viewer retention. And I'm not gonna lie, I'll have to fix this if I want to be able to continue doing YouTube. So I'll try to cut down on the fluff a lot for a while and see if it helps, and I'll also have to edit the painting segments a bit tighter. If you want to see anything I paint here in more detail with more instructions, then you can join the Patreon to see the full-length tutorials. I already put them there, just follow the link in the description. I applied a layer of flavor on flesh with the airbrush to speed things up. Of course you can use a brush, but then it's probably better to prime the miniature white. The blade guard is formed by First Company veterans, Deathwing in this case, and that's why I put the wings and the sword on the right shoulder, even though usually it's on the left for blade guard. My viewers helped me with what to put on the other shoulder during one of my live streams. They're Inner Circle veterans, they may use the Crocs. Okay, yeah, we'll probably do that. So I leaned into the former Terminator Marine narrative and put a Crocs on the other shoulder. I wanted to add some additional details, so I cut away the skull from these laurels and added them on top of the Crocs. I really like how this makes it look even more like the heraldry of a veteran. Once everything was in place, I used a little microsole to smooth out the decals and make them conform to the round shape better. and then I added a layer of matte varnish which equals out the surfaces and gets rid of the edges of the decals where pigment could accumulate and ruin the effect. Time to add some battle damage. I loaded a sponge with Flayed One Flesh and got rid of most of the color until it left the pattern I was happy with. I connect a few of these chips with a brush for more intriguing patterns, but you can of course skip this if you're in a rush. I also make some of these scratches longer, and all of this pays off later when everything comes together. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. My approach for shading bone armor hasn't changed much over the years. I generally mix a sepia wash and a bit of yellow-brown. That way I can retain the property of a wash while slightly modulating the color more towards the final result I want. And as you can see, I throw the wash all over to cover all recesses, and I'm directing the pigment towards areas that I want more shaded. The first layer creates a nice subtle shade, and you could just leave it like this if you want. I know that some people prefer this look because it's relatively smooth and brighter overall. Personally, I want to add more contrast, and since I'm aiming for a grimdark result, I also don't mind if the result is a bit rougher. Washes are super effective means to create quick gradients if you babysit the pigments a bit towards areas you want shaded. I'm repeating the steps for the whole mini until I'm happy with the intensity and placement of shades. Wherever I want highlights, I leave the Flayed One Flesh more or less untouched. You can see that on the shoulders, for example. I'm cleaning up all the edges with Flayed One Flesh to add back some contrast and definition, but this also serves as a base for the weathering and chipping later. I don't want to spend a lot of time defining the lower edges of the chipping like you would on a showcase mini, and this bright edge highlight will achieve a similar effect much quicker. Grimdark to me is not about one particular technique or product, and definitely not about always doing the same thing. It's about a certain feeling to the result, and there's many ways to get there. I get many requests for recipes for particular chapters because of my Grimdark Blood Angels and Ultramarine videos, and some of you probably expected a similar recipe for this. And sure, you can apply a bone color over a dark base coat with a sponge like this, highlight it up, and so on, but I don't really like the look. The step up in value of the color is too big, and you probably could make it work, but it would involve mixing a lot more in between layers than I want to. The technique just doesn't fit the outcome I want. That means I have to adapt the technique. And overall, I just like the more controlled look a bit better in this case. Just like with my Grimdark Imperial Fists, I think bright colors do benefit from this approach a lot more. And you can still add some structure with stippling or sponging at the highlight stage over the washes if you want more structure to show. I know it would be way easier to just tell you the same technique over and over in these videos, but I want you to see that there are many approaches and that you can pick whatever works for you from this arsenal that we have at our disposal. If there's anything that I want to sell you, is the tools to create your own vision and not someone else's. Next up, I added dark chipping with charcoal, which dries super matte, and that helps a lot with selling the effect. Again, you can go more subtle than this, but I'm leaning into a more heavy weathering with the Grimdark series. I'm focusing on the edges, which are usually areas that receive more wear, and I don't mind if the sponge creates some heavier chunks now and then. It all just fits into the narrative. And because the sponge is not the most precise tool, I add some additional wear on the edges with the brush. Again, I'm just showing you options here. You can totally skip this if you want quicker results. I based all the parts I wanted metallic in dark aluminium. I wanted the Dark Angels green in the scheme somewhere, but I didn't want to make the eagle just green, so I added washes of contrast to retain some of the metallic shine. I never did this before, so I started with a diluted wash and ultimately had to add a second layer. And I dabbed on a bit of pure contrast paint in these deepest recesses to make them even darker. To add some contrast and to tie the eagle together with the armor, I gave the chest eagle a wash of Mournfang brown and then a more confined wash of Scrag brown. This adds a nice dusty residue effect on the recesses and makes the green a little more interesting. The parts I washed with contrast paint lacked a bit of shine, so I mixed white aluminium with yellow contrast paint and brought back some of these reflective highlights on the green. You can see how the highlight starts looking yellow because of this, which is a great fit for the green, I think. I wanted a very particular muted green for the robes, and I used the base color of Dark Angel's Green contrast paint, mixed with graphite over the white base coat on the tabard and the hood. I mixed in a bit of Sybarite green and started to apply highlights. And I wanted all the cloth parts to be heavily textured, so I opted for stippling. I spent a bit of extra time on getting the dots as evenly as possible. But the good thing with stippling is, it will usually look good even if done faster. The further down on the tabard, the more I leave the shade color visible, and the further up, like on the top of the hood, I make sure the highlight layer is more consistent, so it's a solid base for the next highlight layer. Wherever I do this, everything appears brighter overall. And as I mix in more Sybarite green, I repeat the same principle. To draw it all together, I gave everything a quick wash of the base color and then added some purple to add color variety. I made sure the shadows received the thicker layer and went for a more glazed consistency over the highlights. I like how this added a subtle yet impactful color shift. Using the typical red and white colors, I added some personal heraldry to the shield on the chest. I split it roughly in half with a diagonal line and added a bit of battle damage in edgewear, and then placed the decal in each of the halves. I also banged that up a little before adding some discoloration with burnt sienna and burnt umber washes. I painted the sheath of the sword green, shaded it with burnt umber towards the upper edge, and added highlights with brush, sponge for some irregularities, and a scratch here and there. I thought about using Deathwing Knight shields for that extra Angel's iconography, but instead I thought I'd get rid of the Indomitus icons and start from a plain shield that I could plaster with freehands. So I was smoothing the surface with sandpaper and filling a few dents caused by the sculpt that ran too deep. And since every video needs a good montage, here's one about how I painted the shield. I give the bolt a casing layer of scarlet blood and started washing it with burnt umber towards the front to get some variety within the red. And if you were wondering why my inks are drying matte, that's because I added some AK Ultra Matte varnish. After I brought back some brighter red on the adjacent areas, I added additional detail to the dark parts by sponging on imperfections and then added highlights with more and more Lugganath orange mixed in. I wanted the skin to be rather pale and applied a base coat of warm grey to the face and then added a bit of scrag brown to the mix as a shade, mainly under the cheekbones and the eye sockets. This adds depth and some semblance of a person that is alive, even if the skin tone is rather pale. I'm also defining parts of the forehead with this mix. I'm painting the beard grey and also add some darker flesh tone to the lips. At that point, I'm also adding more and more ice yellow to the skin color and highlight up the features of the face. And I'm also highlighting the beard with ice yellow to keep the light consistent. I added a few dark brush strokes for eyebrows, and then I used an almost black to paint the pupil and called the face done. Before I put in the finishing touches, I noticed that the tablet lacked a bit of detail in the lower area, so I highlighted the outline with a blue-gray and added some random imperfections, followed by some horizontal lines to make it look more like a torn fabric. I quickly threw together a simple base and painted it up with a base layer, dry brushed highlights and a wash. And then I added 2 colors of pigment with a soft brush, spread them out and mix them at the same time for some variety. I also touched the feet up a bit with the dust, which is pretty effective to show that your marine was existing in this environment for a while. As always, painting the black trim wraps up the mini and we can pan over to the final result. It was a lot of fun painting bone armor again, this time in the Grimdark style. And remember, Grimdark is about a result that gives you the feeling of a gritty existence and a universe worn down by constant conflict and struggle, and not about a single technique. Because a technique might not be appropriate when the premise changes, in this case working with a bright armor instead of dark tones, and sometimes that means having to adapt the approach to the desired outcome and not trying to force an outcome with an approach that might not be able to produce the result you want. Thanks a lot for making it this far into the video. If you enjoyed it, giving it a thumbs up supports the channel massively, and if you want to help keeping the channel running, any support on Patreon goes a long way. And remember, there's about 90 minutes more educational material about this figure, as well as hundreds of instructional painting videos on there too. We also have a Discord community where you can get feedback and general painting advice. These guys already are supporting on Patreon and are the true heroes of this channel, as it wouldn't exist anymore without them. Thank you all so much for that. Keep pushing that pigment, and don't be afraid, it's only paint. With the Leviathan box coming out, it's obvious that the big stars are the new Terminator armor Space Marines. But I have always been rooting for the underdog. Also, you guys requested Grimdark Salamanders ever since the first episode came out, so the natural choice was to paint one of the new Infernus Marines in a salamander pattern. Because giant f***ing flamers. So I started from a 50-50 mix of Rhinox hide and Mournfang brown over a black base coat. But as always, any red brown will do. This serves as an underpainting for the green layers that I will apply more loosely and inconsistent, which we usually try to avoid when painting, but this gives the impression of a worn layer of paint on an armor that has seen some shit and needs to be restored soon by some lobotomized servant. The first layer of green that I applied was Caliban green, and as always I'm using a sponge to apply this layer, both because it's quick and it gives exactly the pattern I'm looking for, where the brown can shine through in some areas. I intentionally leave out most of the edges because that's where the most damage will occur. Don't leave all the edges out though, as in my experience that can quickly look forced and unrealistic. Not all areas receive the same wear, some are more prone to it than others. You can think about which ones would get banged up more and apply the paint accordingly. Areas I can't properly reach with a sponge I cover with an old brush. There's no need for a perfect tip here, the slightly splayed hairs just add to the effect. Technically you could paint all of this by brush or all of it with a sponge. In my experience, starting with a sponge and transitioning into some detailing with the brush has been the best trade-off between quality of the end result and speed. You can of course adjust this to whatever end of the spectrum is more important to you. To go brighter with the green, I'm mixing in Warpstone Glow in a ratio of about 3 parts to 1 part of Caliban green, and I just repeat the steps, covering slightly less area than the layer before, so some of the Caliban green still shines through. Again, you can see that both a brush or a sponge are viable tools for doing this. Eventually, I give everything another layer of pure Warpstone Glow. I feel like this color is the best choice for achieving that saturated salamander green, but of course, there's many ways to get a green you like. Which color choices are your favorites for salamanders? Let me know in the comments. This layer of paint is basically my midtone, so I build it on all areas that would not be shaded in a traditional painting approach. This is a good rule of thumb if you want to follow this tutorial. At this point I switched to the brush to have more control in these more confined areas like the shoulder trim. I left the inside of the shoulder pads untouched for now, because I would later paint them black and add some fire freehands. And do you know what else is fire? This week's sponsor, Mech Arena. Everything is better with mechs. Even Warhammer thinks so. And if you don't want to paint one in real life, you can climb the ranks in a pre-painted one in this fun and fast-paced online PvP shooter game. You can choose from multiple playstyles, brawl your way through your opponents, use mech abilities to outsmart your enemies, or snipe the hell out of the opposition. Mech Arena is free to play, you can play on mobile or desktop. Its many fast-paced game modes allow you to have fun for 10 minutes or multiple hours. And one of the coolest ways to play, in my opinion, is the tournament mode. In these weekly competitions, you are competing for epic rewards, and even if you are new to the game, don't worry, you'll be matched against players of your level so you can have fun without getting farmed by the big boys like me. These weekly high score competitions last for 6 days. Whatever battle score you can accumulate during its duration determines your final ranking. Earning battle score is simple, just blow up your opponents more than they blow up you. You also get rewarded for assisting teammates with their kills. And finally, accumulating kill streaks or becoming MVP gives you additional points. And if you score high enough, you'll get promoted to a higher bracket where you can earn even more rewards the following day. June will bring us a new sci-fi themed event, including spectacular new maps, chain gun, new heavy-duty weapon, the Scorpius, a new attacker mech, and a new heavy-duty pilot. Mech Arena is completely free to play on mobile or PC. Use my personal link or scan the QR code on screen to get a free starter pack worth $15, including a Prodigy crate, 300 A coins, and a Pulse Cannon 4 to help kickstart your game. Oh, and if you feel lucky, you can add me to friends using my mech ID. We can play some matches together. So don't hesitate, follow my link or scan my QR code, and let's play. At this point I added mood green to the warpstone glow to paint some highlights, and I'm doing so by defining some of the shapes a little further. On the color, I can get away with dabbing it on in a rougher way, because the area is so confined, the patchiness creates a nice color gradient. On the helmet, I'm making sure more of the shape is covered to emphasize the dome shape and how much light it catches. Also remember that when doing volumetric highlights, you want to make sure to highlight more inspired by reality. That's why I'm pushing the color towards the small opening of the crest on the helmet. And of course I have to continue that highlight on the highest point of the helmet up here. The last step was to add more specular highlights with pure mute green. As you can see on the knees and any cylindrical shapes like the arms where they face up. For the black on the shoulders, I started from a mix of about 3 parts charcoal and 1 part black and applied it in broad strokes where it didn't matter too much if everything was covered in a consistent layer. Then I added some Sons of Forest green and sponged on highlights, going 1 step brighter for a second highlight. Then I washed the recesses with a very dark and deep red for some color variety. Red recesses on black always have a particular appeal to me. I really wanted to have fun with the fire pattern, so I aimed for a more fast and loose way, not caring too much how clean the result would look, and I sketched on the shapes of the flames. After I was happy with the outline of the fire, I gradually added brighter colors. I started with a saturated orange, making the flames brighter the further down I got, eventually using pure orange. Then I added yellow and did the same thing, covering less and less area. At this point it was time to create the brightest part of the fire, where it almost glows white, so I added more and more white to the yellow, and I made sure I had some areas that were completely white before I added the black round shapes that are typical for the salamander shoulder patterns. I was just using pure black and I carefully made the shapes bigger until I was happy, and wherever I lost too much of the glow, I quickly added some pure white. To draw it all together, I glazed on a thin layer of Imperial Fist, and you can see how much intensity this gives to the whole pattern, and then towards the bottom I also added a few glazes of Nocturnal Red, to make it look like the black parts are covered in a bit of glow from the fire. To finish the pattern off, I added some chips of black with a sponge until I was happy. Now, ideally you have decals of the Salamander chapter icon, but I didn't. So here's a montage of me freehanding one. I wasn't entirely happy with the initial shape, so I used the original mix I painted on the shoulder to clean it up. I think it turned out pretty okay for 5 minutes of work. At last, I added some battle damage with a sponge and used the glaze of burnt umber ink to draw everything together. I quickly painted all the areas I wanted to be metallic with a layer of dark aluminium. Salamanders have a really bright gold chest eagle, so I used my usual recipe for gold, painting a layer of metal and then washing it with contrast paint and ink for that really intense gold color. For the flamethrower casing, I recycled a color I already used, which is Sons of Forest Green, and I stippled it on over the brown and black I had on there already, leaving out the areas facing the upper edges to create some extra contrast with the bright edge highlights. And I added more and more ivory to make the patterns brighter until I was happy with the contrast. The eagle looked good as is, but I felt like I had to tone it down a little for the Grimdark gods and added some Briar Queen chill. The idea was to create some more outlandish staining or verdigris than we're used to. This time I picked yellow for the eye lenses and painted them with a mix of Rhinoxide and yellow that I gradually highlighted up towards the lower edges with pure yellow, and when that was done, I rounded it out with an apex highlight of white in the opposite corner. One last detail I wanted to finish before I would paint the discolored heat dispenser of the flamethrower was the purity seal. I opted for a line pattern on the parchment, for which I used some beige that I highlighted up with ivory, and I used a purple on the seal that I slapped a highlight on with Wild Rider Red, which I desaturated further with a bit of ivory. I know it doesn't particularly fit the Ceramite armor lore, but I wanted the dark edges of the armor to be broken up a bit with some metallic highlights. I made sure not to place them everywhere, because I believe that would just delete a big portion of the readability of the scheme, but just a bit here and there until I was happy. Finally, it was time to do the heat dispenser, and I tried this in the past with a couple of colors, and ideally I wanted to use Games Workshop shades because they're the most translucent, but ultimately they don't stain enough and are a pain to work with, so I opted for contrast paint and sepia ink. You could just replace the sepia ink with any yellowish contrast paint, I just don't have them all. If we look at reference pictures, the metal starts to stain in a distinct yellow-brown tone, and then transitions into a purple and eventually rich blue tone, which I wanted to replicate. So I'm starting with the sepia and I'm glazing it on towards the areas I ultimately want darker, so the initial transition is a bit smoother. Ultimately, it took me 3 layers of a mix of about 3 parts ink and 1 part glaze medium, which I recommend using. Of course, you could also use Lamia medium, which is a type of glaze medium. I left the part that would ultimately be blue untouched, so that area wouldn't end up too dark, before I took Leviathan purple, also thinned that with glaze medium, and started to add layer after layer. Again, pushing away the pigments from where the gradient starts for that extra smoothness. This took a few layers again until I was happy, and after that I could add the final layer of Leviathan blue. The transition from purple to blue is a bit more subtle, so I basically stippled on the blue and gradually extended it into the purple area. Towards the very end, I eventually added some pure Leviathan blue to make that part a lot darker. And I also added some of the blue to the ignition mechanism, and eventually also gave it a few layers of black so it looked charred from the fire. Before calling it done, I wanted to clean up some parts, so I used white aluminium for that, and also added an edge highlight to the left, as well as on the lower edges of the holes. The shoulder pads looked a little too boring, so one last thing I did was add scrag brown to the inverted edges next to the shoulder trims, which makes for a great effect and also adds to the readability. It just distinguishes the black further from the green trims and adds a bit of an additional color. Just built a simple base as always. Added some pigments and also added some pigments to the lower part of the feet for some extra immersion. And here's the final reveal. I always enjoy doing these Marines so much, and I'm happy that you guys are also watching them. Not a single one of them is below 100k views, which makes me really proud, and it's a show that these videos are a win-win situation for both the channel and you, the audience. I definitely don't want to just create these type of videos, but I will always sprinkle one in now and then where it makes sense, like with the Deathwing scheme when the Dark Angels released, and the Infernus Marine in a Salamander scheme this time, which was also a good excuse to work on a bit of a heat-stained metal, which is something I wanted to show in a tutorial for a long time. So let me know what you think of the end result, and definitely put your suggestions for which chapter I should do in the next iteration in the comments. If you want to see any of the other chapters I did, check out this playlist, or if you are looking forwards to the other half of the Leviathan box, you can watch this video where I streamlined some of the official Tyranid color schemes. If you liked the video, a thumbs up supports the channel massively, and any support on Patreon goes a long way too. Thanks for watching, keep pushing that pigment, and see you in the next one.